Hello, my name is Claire. Welcome to my video on this special day, January 5th, 12th night, the eve of Epiphany. Traditionally the final day of celebration of the 12 days of Christmas, and a day of celebration for me because it's my birthday. In July last year, I went to see the Everyman Theatre production of William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. The setting for the production was the swinging 60s. It had a summer of love vibe, music and flower power. A perfect backdrop for the alternative title, What You Will. Duke Orsino is lovesick for Olivia. Viola, dressed as a boy, falls in love with Orsino, and his love interest Olivia falls in love with Viola dressed as a boy. Antonio falls in love with Sebastian. There's a party atmosphere with an excess of love, music and drinking. You might almost think that they're all on drugs. So why is the play called Twelfth Night? Why a wintry title for a play which has such a summer vibe? Twelfth Night is a night of feasting and fun, where servants and masters switch places. A topsy-turvy festival. Even though the play has a slightly topsy-turvy feel to it, there is no switching of lords and servants. Let's start by finding out when the play was written. Let's be clear about this. No one knows a precise date when any Shakespeare's plays were written. You may have seen it stated that this play was written in 1601. It's a possible date, but not a definite date. Scholars sometimes use publication date to estimate when a play was written. In this case, there are no published copies of the play prior to it being published in the first folio in 1623. If there is a record of performance, then we have the latest date by which a play could have been written. But the play could have been around for a while. In 1595, an anonymous play, Lelia, originally written in Latin, was performed at Cambridge University. It bears a striking resemblance to Twelfth Night. The main source play, Glinganati, features the character Lelia, who disguises herself as a boy named Fabio and enters the service of Flaminio, the man she loves. Flaminio is in love with Isabella, who pursues Fabio, Lelia in disguise. A performance of Twelfth Night, or What You Will, at Middle Temple in February 2nd, 1602, was mentioned by a lawyer called John Manningham in his diary. He likens the play to a comedy of errors, and also mentions the resemblance to Plautus' Roman play Minacmi and an Italian play called Glinganati, published in 1537. In his diary, he also recounts his favourite scene, where Malvolio is tricked into thinking that Olivia is in love with him, after he is given a letter forged by Olivia's maid. The play must have been in existence in a form we recognise by 1602, but may have been around earlier. To find out more about the date this play was written, please read The Dating of Shakespeare's Plays by Kevin Gilvari. Even though traditional scholars think that Shakespeare used the story of Apollonius and Scylla in Farewell to a Military Profession by Barnaby Rich, Dr. Michael Delahoyd thinks that Barnaby Rich had poached the story from Shakespeare. Rich stated in the conclusion of his book that some of the stories had already been applied to the stage. I think that both could be true. Sir Christopher Hatton was Barnaby Rich's patron. If Barnaby Rich stole Shakespeare's story, then Shakespeare used his play to lampoon Sir Christopher Hatton through the character of Malvolio. There is evidence that the play went through rewrites. The character Viola suggests that she would present herself to the Duke as a eunuch performer. This idea of singing for the Duke never gets fulfilled in the first folio version of the play. The main source was Piccolomini's Commedia Eredute Glinganati, a popular play in 16th century Siena. It was thought to be contrived by a group of players called Intronati, following an uproar when the ladies of Siena were insulted, real or feigned, by the play Il Sacrifici. a play involving a procession of men to Minerva, the spear-shaking goddess, which was first performed during the Twelfth Night festivities, 1531. Is it possible that Shakespeare saw a production of Glinganati in Siena on Twelfth Night? There are no records that Twelfth Night was performed at the public theatre prior to publication. Some people have thought that the play depicted in the sketch shown here of the Swan Theatre is Twelfth Night, but we don't know. De Witt's diary has been lost, and only the sketch remains. The strutting fellow in the sketch could be Malvolio. From the extract from John Manningham's diary, we know that the play was performed at the Middle Temple of the Inns of Court. Shakespeare is known for his use of legal terms. The author probably put in legal details for the amusement of the law students. The duel in Act 4 is a comical example in which the law of self-defence leads to a duel in which the combatants are unwilling to strike the first blow. The play is set in the palaces of Olivia and the Duke of Orsino. The allegory of Queen Elizabeth and her Lord Chancellor, Sir Christopher Hatton, as Olivia and her chief steward Malvolio, would suggest that the play was written to be performed at court for the amusement of the Queen, although there is no named record of a performance of Twelfth Night at court. In 1732, Francis Peck described a manuscript that he intended to publish as a pleasant conceit of Vere, Earl of Oxford, discontented at the rising of a mean gentleman in the court, circa 1580. This description would certainly apply to Sir Christopher Hatton. The manuscript was never published and is now lost. The manuscript had belonged to Abraham Fleming, who was a secretary to the Earl of Oxford around 1580. The play Twelfth Night would certainly have flattered the Queen, who is loved and pursued by various suitors, and amused her by making fun of Hatton. Hatton was a favourite of the Queen, and he, in return, adored her, and like her, he never married. Perhaps he had hopes that the Queen would choose him. Even though he was a member of the delegation sent to arrange the marriage of the Queen to the Duke of Alençon, he advised the Queen against the match. Like Malvolio, Hatton seemed to have ideas above his station in relation to his mistress. When Queen Elizabeth hosted Duke Orsino, the Twelfth Night celebrations include an unnamed comedy. Some have speculated that it may have been Twelfth Night. As the court were only informed of the Duke's visit on Christmas Day, there would not have been time to commission a new play for his visit 11 days later. It is unlikely that Twelfth Night was the play performed, but if it was, it would suggest that it was not a new play. The portrayal of a lovesick Duke Orsino over such an obvious allegory for the Queen might have insulted the real Duke Orsini, who was married. There is much more compelling reason why the Duke was named Orsino. The source play, Glinganati, although most famously performed in Siena, was set in Naples. Shakespeare set his play in Illyria, which critics describe as a nowhere place, an imaginary creation, but Illyria was a real place. Shakespeare might have chosen Illyria because it had a reputation for lawlessness and piracy. It was also remote and little known. Illyria, spelt Illyris, is mentioned in Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Shakespeare's favourite source. So why did Shakespeare choose the Italian name Orsino? None of the Orsini involved in the politics of Elizabethan England had any connection with Illyria. The various Italianisms in the play suggest that the author was familiar with Italy. Shakespeare has often been criticised for imagining noble characters and mixing up their titles. In Act 1, Orsino is called Duke, and then later referred to as Count. There is no mix-up. Shakespeare knew his geography and his history. Up until the 14th century, the Orsini were the rulers of Illyria. The Orsini of Epirus, the southern tip of Illyria, had the title Duke and Count Palatine of Kefalonica, Zante, and Ithaca. The Orsini remained counts of these islands until they were seized by the Venetian Republic in the 15th century. At the time when Shakespeare may have visited these lands, Nicola Orsini still styles himself the Count of Kefalonica. The Venetian-controlled Dubrovnik, or Ragusa, in the 1500s, was in a precarious situation, placed between the Christian Habsburgs to the north and the Muslim Ottoman Empire to the south. Christian soldiers in the area fighting the Ottomans, called Uzkoks, were not well supported by the Habsburgs, so they resorted to looting and piracy. Antonio is an Uzkok leader. Chronicles of Venetian agents describing the war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire, 1571 to 1576, write of chivalrous escapades, tournaments, and single combats. Antonio appears to have a sporting attitude to this war. In Act 2, Scene 1, when Sebastian tells Antonio that he is bound for Count Orsino's court, Antonio says, "I have many enemies at Orsino's court, else I would shortly see thee there. But come what may, I do adore thee so, that danger shall seem sport, and I will go." Later, in Act 3, Scene 3, due to the danger Antonio faced in the streets of the town, he suggests they meet up in the south suburbs at the Elephant. I will explain later why I have discounted the area of South London known as the Elephant and Castle. In the context of the play, the Elephant is more likely to refer to the Elephant Islands just off the coast of Croatia, near Dubrovnik. These islands would have been a relatively safe haven for an Uzkok outlaw. In Act 4, Scene 1, Sebastian says to Feste, "I prithee, foolish Greek, depart from me." Merry Greek was a familiar expression, but not foolish Greek. The fact that Greek was the official language of Byzantine Illyria is further evidence of Shakespeare's knowledge of the region. Last year, I made a visit to Windsor Castle for the Queen's Jubilee. In one of the rooms, I was immediately impressed by a suit of armour, obviously made for a tall, slim, elegant and wealthy man. On reading the label, I was surprised to find that it belonged to Sir Christopher Hatton. Hatton gifted the armour to the Queen's lifelong favourite, and some say lover, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. This might tell us something about the Queen's taste in men. Hatton was a high flyer in the court of Queen Elizabeth. He had enrolled in St Mary's Hall, Oxford, as a gentleman commoner. Leaving there without a degree, he then enrolled in the Inner Temple. It was while performing in a masque at the Inner Temple that he caught the Queen's eye. According to Naunton, he came to court by the galliard, for he came thither as a private gentleman of the Inns of Court in a masque. And for his activity in person, which was tall and portionable, taken into the Queen's favour. Known by some as the Dancing Chancellor, the Queen called him her lids, or her sheep. When Sir Andrew says, "I can cut a caper," Sir Toby replies, "And I can cut the mutton to it." Sir Toby is making a quip about mutton, the Queen's sheep, the Dancing Chancellor. Later, Sir Toby calls Malvolio sheep biter. Another clue that Malvolio is Hatton is that the prank letter is signed "The Fortunate and Happy," an echo of Hatton signing his letters to Elizabeth, Fortunatus Infelix. Edmund Campion was a Jesuit priest who lived like a hermit in Prague before coming to England. Whilst in England, he travelled the country, performing secret Catholic masses. He was soon arrested and convicted of treason and locked in a dungeon. The puritanical Hatton was sent to question the Jesuit in his cell. Campion was also brought out for public disputations. Scholars from the Anglican Church tried to discredit him, claiming that he was involved in a Catholic plot to kill the Queen and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Campion was denied books and pen and paper with which to prepare his defence. In the third public disputation, Campion asked for the books of Augustine and Chrysostom to show their teachings. His opponent, William Fulk, a puritanical scholar, claimed that he had already answered these teachings in writing, and challenged Campion, "If you think that you can add anything, put it in writing." Campion replies, "Provide me with ink and paper, and I will write." Fulk immediately realises his mistake and has to backpedal, causing the government a great deal of embarrassment. Campion conducted himself with such eloquence that the spectators called for his acquittal. But his fate had already been decided prior to the disputations. He was hung, drawn and quartered for treason in December 1581. Shakespeare is holding a mirror up to the puritanical Hatton, portraying him as Malvolio locked in a cellar. Feste, dressed as a Jesuit, goes to harangue him. Maria urges Feste to put on a gown to disguise himself as Sir Topaz the curate. Feste says, "Well, I'll put it on, and I will dissemble myself in it, and I would that I were the first that ever dissembled in such a gown." Sir Toby, on seeing Feste in disguise, says, "Jove bless thee, Master Parson." Robert Parsons was a Jesuit who travelled with Campion. Shakespeare parodies the attempts to get Campion to renounce his faith with illogical argument, when Feste refuses to release Malvolio unless he upholds the Pythagorean belief in the transmigration of souls, in the same way that the Catholic Edmund Campion would have found the arguments of the Puritans illogical. Malvolio, in his cell, asks Feste repeatedly for paper, ink, and a light. Some scholars have suggested that Sir Andrew Aguecheek is a parody of Sir Philip Sidney. There is a disease that has been dubbed Aguecheek disease. Patients with cirrhosis of the liver have a neurological disorder and personality changes which is eased by reducing protein in the diet. Sir Toby says that Sir Andrew plays the viol de gamboy and speaks 3 or 4 languages word for word without a book. Maria says that he is a fool, a quarreller, and is drunk nightly. When Sir Andrew says, "I'll ride home tomorrow," Sir Toby says, "Pourquoi?" Sir Andrew seems to have forgotten his French and is unable to find the meaning of the common word pourquoi. A nobleman would probably have been able to speak French fluently. It is likely that Sir Toby was telling the truth, that Sir Andrew was an accomplished linguist. Perhaps Sir Andrew is suffering from a neurological condition brought on by an excess of alcohol and a meat-based diet. Some noblemen thought it beneath themselves to eat vegetables, which was a diet reserved for peasants. The portrait of Sir Philip shown here does appear to have more ruddy tones than other portraits of the time. There is a game called the Sir Philip Sidney game, which I can't quite seem to grasp. It was devised from a story that when Sir Philip Sidney was wounded on the battlefield, he gave his water to another soldier, saying that his need was greater. Sir Philip died of his wounds shortly afterwards, in October 1586. Sir Toby demands money from Andrew, and in return Sir Andrew seems to supply him with as much as he wants. Maria says of Sir Andrew, "He is a great quarreller. Would that he hath the gift of a coward to allay the gust he has in quarrelling." There is a famous quarrel between Sir Philip Sidney and the Earl of Oxford over a game of tennis. The quarrel was witnessed by visiting French ambassadors. Queen Elizabeth chastised Sir Philip for picking a quarrel with someone of higher rank. There is no love lost between Shakespeare and Sidney. Sidney's Astrophel and Stella sonnets were mocked by Shakespeare. Sir Toby Belch is thought to represent Peregrine Bertie, and Maria, who calls herself by the more anglicised name Mary, is thought to represent Peregrine Bertie's wife Mary. Peregrine Bertie almost bankrupted himself, self-financing the diplomatic missions he was sent on by Queen Elizabeth. Peregrine Bertie, Lord Willoughby, was a popular hero who was a general at the Battle of Zutphen, in which Sir Philip Sidney died. To outline the reasons why Olivia's character is based on Queen Elizabeth I would take a whole presentation in itself. I will mention a few. The Countess Olivia has inherited her title and wealth following the death of her brother. She is the niece of a legendary King Gorboduc, whereas Queen Elizabeth's uncle was named after the legendary King Arthur. Arthur died before his father, and his brother Henry succeeded to the throne. Cesario says to Olivia, "Lady, you are the cruellest she alive if you would lead these graces to the grave and leave the world no copy." Queen Elizabeth had many suitors who she refused. In 1680, there were negotiations for Queen Elizabeth to marry Hercule François Duc d'Alençon. The Queen, in her late 40s, was running out of time if she was to marry and produce an heir. She came very close to marrying the Duke, but more about this in the next video. I think that the names sound alike, both beginning with a vowel and having 4 syllables. Elizabeth, Olivia. Shakespeare has a knowledge of seafaring beyond that which could have been found in books on navigation in print at the time. This print, dating 1600, shows the small Uscock boats chasing a Venetian galley. Shakespeare knows the types of boats used in the Adriatic, the large Venetian galleys and the smaller craft used by the Uscocks. He also knows about war, sea battles, pirates, and storms at sea. "That face of his I do remember well, yet when I saw it last, it was besmeared, as black as Vulcan in the smoke of war. A bawbling vessel was he captain of, for shallow draught, and bulk unprizable, with which such scatheful grapple did he make with the most noble bottom of our fleet, that the very envy and tongue of loss cried fame and honour on him." It's difficult for me to say how much of Shakespeare's knowledge of the law is represented in Twelfth Night. It takes a person with knowledge of the law to recognise the use of it. I'm sure that the performances at the Inns of Court got laughs that performances on the public stage did not. His knowledge of psychological disorders in this play seems to go beyond mere midsummer madness. Thank you for staying with me this far. Up until this point, I have tried to put the play into context without making too many assumptions. I think that there is a tendency to make assumptions about the author and then to ignore any evidence that doesn't fit. So, now I would like to compare candidates based on the historical evidence that we have. Let's compare the traditional candidate with the leading alternative candidate, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. The choice of boy and girl twins could be because the author was using his biographical details in the play for his son and daughter, Hamlet and Judith. It could equally be a plot device to cause confusion and mayhem. As women were not allowed to play on the Elizabethan stage, it would make sense that the part of Viola was written for castrate, as this is the disguise that Viola intends to use. The reference to meeting up at the Elephant could mean the Elephant Inn, but the inn in Southwark was a blacksmith's from 1641 and was only converted to an inn in the 1700s. The elephant and castle motif is likely to have come from the arms used by the Worshipful Company of Cutlers, which was granted in 1622, well after the play was written. However, the Elephant Islands off the coast of Croatia were mentioned by the name Elefiti by Pliny in the 1st century. That the picture of the Swan Theatre depicts Twelfth Night is speculative. If it is, then the play was written prior to 1596. No one knows when Shakespeare wrote the plays. We can make assumptions through source materials and performance dates. It has taken me some time to compile the evidence for this video, and throughout my research the same dates kept cropping up, 1580 and 1581. The date of the Earl of Oxford's pleasant conceit, 1580, the date of Campion's imprisonment and mock trial, 1580 and 1581, marriage negotiations between the Duc d'Alençon and Queen Elizabeth I were taking place from 1578 to 1580. The marriage negotiations may have been the catalyst for the argument between De Vere and Sidney in 1580. I think the lampooning of Sir Christopher Hatton through the character of Malvolio is beyond doubt. The characterisation of Sir Philip Sidney as Andrew Aguecheek is more tenuous. But I believe that if they are the subjects of ridicule, the play must have been written before their deaths in 1591 and 1586 respectively. The comparison between Elizabeth and Olivia being urged to take a husband and produce an heir doesn't make sense if the play was written after 1586, when the Queen would have been in her 50s. In 1580, William Shakespeare of Stratford was 16 years old. If the date of the first public performance was 1601, then any allusions to the events of 1580 would have been mostly forgotten. For Shakespeare to have known so much about Olivia, he must have been there. Perhaps Shakespeare of Stratford visited during the lost years, although there is no evidence that he ever left the country. There is a period of 4 months when De Vere was on his travels which are undocumented. We know that during this time he sailed in a Venetian galley on the Adriatic Sea. It's likely that he visited the city of Dubrovnik, the Venetian protectorate. Soon after De Vere's servant wrote to Lord Burleigh that his master had sustained a knee injury on board a galley, De Vere was in Siena for the Christmas celebrations, as evidenced by a letter he sent from there on the 3rd of January 1576. Did he watch Minerva shaking her spear on Twelfth Night in Siena? The author Shakespeare had a specialist knowledge of law, medicine, geography and history. Even though it's not impossible that the man from Stratford gained this knowledge somehow, there is no evidence that he did. Edward de Vere was trained at the Inns of Court. He was taught by the best tutors. He had access to an extensive library both in England and in Venice. He was fluent in Italian, so even if he had not visited Olivia, he would have had access to the books about the history of the area. If the goings-on in Twelfth Night seem like Bedlam, in 1580, there's that date again, De Vere purchased Fisher's Folly, where he appears to host a hive of writers. The Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital, otherwise known as Bedlam, was right across the street from Fisher's Folly. Would Shakespeare be allowed to make fun of the people in court in this way? Writers were put in the Tower for less. If he was the Earl of Oxford, he might have been. He was Elizabeth's allowed fool. He knew how to make her laugh. He was her feste. I would like to urge you all to be open-minded and look at the documentary evidence. I am sure that in every play there are clues to the real author, and with that in mind, thank you so much for watching Shakespeare in Context with me, Claire Davis. I will try and put links to my sources below. Please like and subscribe, and if you have any comments, please be kind. And I hope you will join me for the next one, my favourite Shakespeare play, A Midsummer Night's Dream.